Lesson 79.
Bill, it's time for readers to start thinking of a new adjective. And that adjective is going to be suis, sua, suum. And we're going to take a lot of care, though, when we're talking about this adjective and take it over a few different lessons, because it's one of the thornier, more tricky things that students have trouble with.
And because it's troublesome to translate sometimes for beginners, I've tried to take great pains to explain it in a way that's clear and gives you plenty of chances to really get a nice slow introduction to it.
So since we're going to take a slow introduction, why don't we start by explaining exactly what we mean in English about how we use this third person singular and plural possessive adjective.
Right, if we put all this into a chart, like a verb, like say the verb ambulo, we can put that into a chart and see the first person, second person, third person forms, the singular and plural forms. So that's what I've done here in this lesson. I've made a little chart to help you imagine or visualize these possessive pronouns with the idea of meus, mea, meum being first person, tuus being second person, noster, nostra, nostrum. You can envision that as being first person, but plural, because it's our stuff. It's like we have stuff. Wester is like second person plural, because it's like y'all have some stuff. It's y'all's stuff. So I put this chart together just to give you yet another way to visualize what these adjectives are doing.
Right. So in one sense, it's really easy. It's third person, this suis adjective. It can be translated in the singular or the plural with his or her or its or their.
Right, because you can see the third row spans across both columns. It's suis, sua, suum is sort of singular and plural, like in English what we would say his, her, its, or their. So it kind of spans singular and plural.
So let's get to the more difficult part now then. So just like we saw earlier with the word that, we have a lot of different ways we use that in English. And so we don't always want to use the word in Latin that we know for different uses in English that we know. And with suis it's going to work in a similar way. So in order to use suis we have to remember two important rules. First, suis is used like any other adjective that you know. It has to agree in case, number, and gender with the word that it's accompanying, the word that it modifies. So you can see in our example here, we have vir pecuniam suam habet. The man has his own money, or the man has his money. And that part is pretty clear. But the other aspect that's maybe not so clear right now from this example is that when we use suis it always has to refer back to the subject of the sentence. And now, let me just say that again so that it's crystal clear, and we'll go into more detail in the next lesson. Suis always has to refer to the subject of the sentence.
So whoever the subject of the sentence is, that's the person that's owning something when you see suis, sua, suum.
Right. And so in English, we can use his or her or its or their to show possession in other ways for other persons in the sentence that aren't the subject. But in Latin, suis doesn't work that way. If they're not the one doing the action of the verb, if they're not the head person in charge of the sentence, then you can't use suis to say his, her, its, or their.
So in English, the word his is flexible. It can mean the person who is the subject of the sentence, or it can mean some other person who is not the subject.
Right, and so in this way, Latin is less flexible, but it's also more clear because we have separate words to show who the thing belongs to. And we won't get into the other words right now for his, her, its, or their, because I think it would just be too confusing. But in the next couple of lessons, we'll practice with suis get into more detail about how to know when we're modifying the subject, and then see it in some of the exercises. Isn't that right, Bill?
Yes. So for right now, the big thing to take away here is that when you see suis, sua, suum being used with some noun, whatever it is belongs to the subject of the sentence. And when you're translating suis, sua, suum into English, you can't look at the gender of the item that is being possessed. That doesn't help you. You have to look at the gender of the person possessing the item. And we have some examples here. We have a sentence, the man has his money. When you translate the word his there, in a Latin sentence, the word his has to agree with the money. Okay? In Latin, that
is, suis has to agree with the money. Isn't that right, Bill?
Yes, and you can see that the next thing we have here is vir, pecuniam suam habet. The man has his money. And we know that suam is going to be translated into English as his because the subject is a man. It's a vir. So when we're making our English translation, you have to look in two directions. You have to look at what suam is going with, and then you have to look at the gender of the person possessing the item. And once you have all those ingredients, you can make your English translation. The next example we have is the woman has her book.
Right. And so the gender of book in this sentence is masculine. The case of book in this sentence is accusative. And so suum is accusative and masculine as well, and they're both singular. But when we translate it, because the book belongs to the woman, we say the woman has her book, even though that doesn't match the gender of suis aum in the Latin sentence.
So in your mind, you have to picture the gender of the item being possessed as one thing, and the gender of the person possessing the item as a separate thing. And they're going to do different things. When you're translating into English, you have to treat them separately so you know how to make an accurate translation. What about this example here I give, Michael? Habet librum suum.
Right.
What do we do with that?
This sentence can seem pretty difficult when you first look at it because, unlike the sentences we saw before, the subject isn't explicitly stated. And so what do I mean by that? Well, habet
right. So who has the book?
That's right. So habet is a third-person singular verb, right? And so we could translate it as he, she, or it has his or her or its or their book. We just don't have enough information because the sentence is here on its own. But in a normal Latin sentence, you know, especially like in one of our exercises, it should be pretty clear what the gender of the thing we're talking about is, right? Because they'll be mentioned in a prior sentence. So you just have to make a decision when you don't have the noun there, whether it's a he, she, an it, or a there, based on the context and the other things you have around.
And the context is always very important when you're trying to figure out how to render something into English. You always have to pay attention to the context.
Right. And one last thing, at least for me. So some of this probably sounds pretty confusing, wouldn't you say, Bill?
To a new student of Latin, this can be confusing. In fact, I remember a million years ago when I had my first Latin class, this really confused me. I did not understand how to translate suis, sua, suum. And for that reason, because it confused me, I'm assuming that it might also confuse you. And that's why I'm taking such time and care to explain this in a clear way so that the thing that confused me when I was young doesn't confuse you, the listener.
Right, exactly. And so if you're still confused right now, don't worry. It's perfectly natural. Part of it you'll pick up just as you get more and more experience doing the exercises throughout the course of this book and in your other Latin studies. But also, for the next 2 lessons, we're going to really focus in on this so that you can overcome anything about this that isn't quite clear.
Yes, by the time we're done explaining it to death, you'll be either bored to tears or you'll understand it really well, or both.